There comes a quiet, chilling moment in every major war when a military commander looks across the battlefield and realizes that defeat is no longer a possibility, but a mathematical certainty. It is not the sudden shock of a brilliant tactical maneuver or an unexpected ambush that breaks a general's spirit. It is the slow, agonizing realization that the enemy is operating on a scale so vast, so relentless, and so completely beyond comprehension that no amount of bravery, discipline, or tactical genius can ever hope to stop it. For the high-ranking officers of the German Wehrmacht in late 1944, that realization did not occur in the grand strategic planning rooms of Berlin. It did not come from reading top-secret intelligence reports or listening to Hitler's increasingly desperate speeches about miracle weapons that were supposed to turn the tide. Instead, it happened in the damp, freezing forests of Western Europe, in ruined French villages, and along muddy roads in the Ardennes. It happened when veteran German commanders raised their binoculars to scan the horizon and saw an endless, terrifying flood of olive-drab steel moving toward them. By the autumn of 1944, the German army on the Western Front was fighting for its very survival. Officers who had conquered Poland, France, and vast swathes of Russia were now reduced to counting their artillery shells one by one. Tank commanders were ordered to turn off their engines whenever possible to conserve every precious drop of synthetic gasoline. Every single Tiger and Panther tank was treated like a priceless, irreplaceable treasure. But when these same German officers peered through their optics across the front lines, they saw a completely different universe. They saw an American military that did not merely wage war. They unleashed an industrial avalanche. They saw endless columns of M4 Sherman tanks, thousands of heavy GMC supply trucks, motorized artillery, and endless streams of supplies, stretching back as far as the eye could see. The Americans were not just fighting a war of soldier against soldier. They were bringing the full weight of the world's greatest industrial power directly onto the battlefield. And in that terrifying sight, veteran German generals saw the future, and they realized that their empire was doomed. To truly understand the psychological shock experienced by German officers when they encountered the full force of American armor, one must first understand the fundamental philosophical divide that shaped how both nations prepared for armored warfare. The German military tradition was built on the concept of quality over quantity. German engineers were obsessed with technological perfection, firepower, and heavy armor. They believed that by creating the absolute finest, most formidable war machines in human history, they could dominate any battlefield regardless of the numbers stacked against them. This design philosophy produced engineering, marvels like the Panzer-Fix Tiger, and later the Panther. The Tiger tank was a terrifying beast of war. Armed with the deadly 88mm Kaunye K-36 gun and protected by thick face-hardened steel armor, a single Tiger could sit on a ridge and destroy an entire platoon of enemy tanks long before they could even get within range to strike back. German tank crews were meticulously trained, highly experienced, and fiercely confident in the superiority of their machines. On paper, and in isolated small-scale engagements, German armor was undeniably superior. However, this obsession with perfection carried a fatal flaw, a flaw that American industrial strategists understood far better than the German high command. German tanks were extraordinarily complex, expensive, and difficult to manufacture. They required highly skilled labor, specialized alloys, and hundreds of thousands of man-hours to produce. If a transmission failed on a Tiger tank in the field, fixing it was a nightmare that often required a heavy crane and days of intense labor. As the war dragged on and Allied bombing raids began flattening German factories and cutting off access to vital raw materials like chromium and nickel, the production of these over-engineered war machines slowed to a crawl. Across the Atlantic Ocean, American military planners were approaching the problem from a radically different perspective. They did not set out to build a delicate, highly complex masterpiece that required constant maintenance from specialized technicians. Instead, they asked a very simple, practical question. How do we mass-produce an effective, reliable, standardized tank that can be manufactured by the tens of thousands in converted automobile plants, shipped across thousands of miles of ocean, and repaired easily in the middle of a muddy field by an 18-year-old mechanic from Ohio? The answer to that question was the M4 Sherman. The Sherman was not designed to be a mythical monster that could win single-handed duels against heavy German tanks. It was designed to be the ultimate workhorse of a global industrial war. It featured a standardized Ford or Chrysler V8 engine, easily interchangeable parts, and a mechanical design so simple and robust that it could run for thousands of miles with minimal maintenance. Where a German Tiger required delicate precision and constant care, the Sherman was tough, adaptable, and remarkably forgiving. When German panzer commanders first encountered the Sherman in large numbers, they initially dismissed it. They mocked its relatively thin armor and its 75mm gun, which struggled to penetrate the front armor of heavy German tanks. They even gave it dismissive nicknames. But as the weeks and months turned into years, the German officers began to realize a horrifying truth that their strategic planners had completely overlooked. A tank's effectiveness is not measured solely by its armor thickness or cannon caliber in a vacuum. It is measured by whether or not the tank is actually on the battlefield when you need it. While German generals were struggling to maintain their dwindling supply lines on the Western Front, thousands of miles away in North America, a transformation was taking place that would forever change the nature of human warfare. In 1940, President Franklin D. Roosevelt issued a bold challenge to the American manufacturing sector. The United States, he declared, must become the great arsenal of democracy. At the time, the U.S. military was surprisingly small, ranking behind nations like Romania in terms of standing army size. But America possessed an industrial backbone that no other nation on earth could match. Almost overnight, the titan of American industry, Detroit, Michigan, shifted its massive automobile manufacturing infrastructure toward total war production. Car companies like Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler completely halted the production of civilian vehicles. Assembly lines that had spent decades churning out sedans and pickup trucks were re-engineered with breathtaking speed to manufacture bombers, artillery, trucks, and above all, tanks. The scale of this mobilization was staggering. At the Willow Run bomber plant, built by Henry Ford, a massive assembly line was constructed that could produce a fully functional B-24 Liberator heavy bomber every single hour. At the Chrysler Detroit Tank Arsenal, an enormous facility built on farmland in Michigan, workers operated around the clock in 3 shifts, 7 days a week. Raw steel entered one side of the massive complex, and fully assembled, engine-tested M4 Sherman tanks rolled out the other side. American factories were not just building tanks, they were standardizing the entire war effort. Every bolt, every gear, every track link, and every electrical component on an M4 Sherman was manufactured to exact tolerances. This meant that a replacement part made in a factory in Indiana would fit perfectly into a tank that was currently sitting in a ditch in Normandy or fighting in the Pacific jungle. Between 1942 and 1945, the United States produced over 49,000 M4 Sherman tanks. To put that figure into perspective, Germany produced fewer than 1,400 Tiger I tanks and roughly 6,000 Panther tanks during the entire course of the war. For every single heavy tank that rolled out of a struggling German factory, American industry produced an overwhelming tsunami of steel armor. When news of these production numbers reached high-ranking German intelligence officers, many of them simply refused to believe it. Nazi advertising had spent years convincing the German public and the military hierarchy that Americans were soft, decadent, and incapable of sustained military sacrifice. German high command assumed that American production figures were exaggerated propaganda designed to intimidate them. But as Allied forces established their foothold in Europe following the D-Day landings in June 1944, German generals on the ground were forced to confront the terrifying reality. The American production figures were not propaganda. If anything, they were an understatement. The Normandy campaign was a brutal battlefield of attrition, fought in the dense, suffocating hedgerow country known as the Bocage. In this tight, labyrinthine terrain, German defensive tactics were exceptionally lethal. German anti-tank crews, hiding behind centuries-old dirt mounds and thick foliage, could easily ambush advancing Allied columns. In many of these early battles, American armored units suffered heavy casualties. It was not uncommon for a single German Panther or a concealed 88mm anti-tank gun to destroy several Sherman tanks in a matter of minutes. In any previous war, suffering such heavy losses would have crippled an advancing army. German commanders calculated that by inflicting high casualties on American armor, they could slow the Allied advance to a crawl, exhaust their reserves, and force a stalemate. But as the weeks wore on, German field officers noticed a deeply disturbing pattern that shattered their strategic assumptions. When a German panzer unit lost 5 tanks in combat, those 5 tanks were gone forever. Their crews had to be reassigned to infantry duty or sent back to wait months for replacements that might never arrive. But when an American armored unit lost 5 Sherman tanks in a morning engagement, something astonishing happened. By the following afternoon, specialized American ordnance companies, equipped with heavy M25 Dragon wagon recovery vehicles, would haul the damaged hulls back to field workshops. Mechanics working under canvas tents in French pastures would swap out damaged parts, clean the vehicles, and return them to service. If a tank was completely destroyed, a brand new Sherman straight off a cargo ship from America would simply drop into its place within days. General Heinz Guderian, one of the primary architects of blitzkrieg tactics and the Inspector General of armored troops, began receiving desperate reports from commanders on the Western Front. Field officers reported that fighting the Americans was like trying to fight the ocean. You could punch a hole in the wave, but the water would immediately fill the gap and keep coming. The psychological impact on German soldiers and high-ranking officers was devastating. German veteran panzer crews, who had spent years believing in their technological superiority, began to experience a profound sense of helplessness. They realized that no matter how many American tanks they managed to destroy, there would always be more. 10 more, 50 more, 100 more, rolling over the horizon with seemingly unlimited ammunition and endless fuel supplies. This disparity reached its absolute climax during the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944. Hitler launched a massive, desperate winter counteroffensive through the Ardennes forest, hoping to split the Allied lines, capture the vital port of Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace. The offensive relied entirely on speed, surprise, and the brutal power of heavy German armor, including the massive 68-ton King Tiger. As the German panzers pushed forward, they achieved initial breakthroughs. But very quickly, the fatal flaw in the German war machine exposed itself once again: logistics. German tanks began running out of fuel in the middle of snow-covered roads. Their heavy armor became trapped on narrow, muddy forest trails, unable to maneuver. Meanwhile, American logistical units demonstrated an astonishing ability to adapt. When German forces threatened key supply depots, U.S. troops systematically destroyed millions of gallons of fuel reserves right under the noses of the advancing German vanguard, denying them the one resource they needed to sustain their momentum. When the weather cleared and Allied tactical air power returned to the skies, American P-47 Thunderbolts and Hawker Typhoons descended upon the trapped German columns. High-ranking German officers like General Hasso von Manteuffel looked out at their immobilized, fuel-starved panzers surrounded by hundreds of advancing American Shermans and realized that the Ardennes offensive was not just a defeat, it was the final death rattle of the German war machine. By early 1945, the Allied armies had crossed the Rhine River and were pushing deep into the heartland of Germany. The war had reached its final, agonizing phase. For the remaining German officers commanding broken regiments and improvised battle groups, the battlefield no longer resembled the grand tactical engagements of 1940 or 1941. It had transformed into a relentless, automated process of total, overwhelming force. What German commanders began referring to as the American mechanical swarm was not just a tactical observation. It was a testament to how completely the United States had integrated industrial power into frontline combat operations. An American infantry division in 1945 did not move on foot like their German counterparts, who still relied heavily on horses for transport and logistics. Every American squad had access to trucks, half-tracks, jeeps, and armored cars. When an American unit encountered a pocket of German resistance, they did not engage in costly, prolonged infantry assaults. Instead, they picked up a radio. Within minutes of a German defensive position opening fire, American forward observers would coordinate a terrifying response. Battery after battery of heavy artillery would unleash an endless barrage of high-explosive shells, guided by spotter aircraft hovering overhead. Simultaneously, platoons of M4 Sherman tanks would roll forward, suppressing the position with heavy machine gun fire and high-explosive rounds. If the resistance persisted, fighter bombers carrying napalm and heavy rockets would dive out of the clouds to pulverize the target. Captured German officers frequently expressed sheer bewilderment at the sheer quantity of material American commanders were willing to expend to secure a single crossroads or a tiny, deserted village. One captured German major famously remarked during an interrogation that the Americans fight with steel, while they were forced to fight with human blood. This stark realization destroyed whatever remaining morale existed within the German officer corps. They realized that the United States military did not view war as an arena for individual heroism or romantic notions of military martial glory. They viewed war as an engineering problem, a problem that could be solved by applying staggering amounts of mechanical force, firepower, and material resources to minimize casualties among their own men while systematically crushing the enemy's capability to resist. In interrogation rooms across liberated Europe, high-ranking German prisoners of war offered candid, sobering assessments of their opponent. General Lieutenant Fritz Bayerlein, a veteran commander of the Afrika Korps and the Panzer Lehr Division, openly admitted that the sheer mobility and endless supply of American armor made defense mathematically impossible. He noted that while they had superior individual tanks, the American tanks were everywhere, and when one was destroyed, three took its place. They were crushed by an industrial titan that never slept. When the final surrender documents were signed in May 1945, ending the nightmare of World War II in Europe, the world looked upon a continent transformed by war. Amidst the ruins of Third Reich cities, silent German Tiger and Panther tanks sat abandoned along cobblestone streets, their tracks broken, their ammunition hoppers empty, and their fuel tanks dry. They stood as massive, rusting monuments to a flawed philosophy that prioritized complex engineering over the harsh, practical realities of global industrial warfare. Parking alongside them in victory parades from Paris to Berlin were thousands of M4 Sherman tanks, mud-splattered, battle-scarred, but fully operational. These olive-drab war machines represented something far greater than mere military hardware. They were the physical embodiment of a free nation's democratic mobilization. They were proof that an open society, powered by industrial innovation, standardized manufacturing, and logistical supremacy, could transform itself overnight into an unstoppable force capable of liberating an entire continent from tyranny. For the German generals who survived the war and spent their remaining years writing memoirs and historical analyses, the lesson of 1944 and 1945 was unforgettable. They had entered the conflict believing that wars were won by tactical perfection and martial tradition. They emerged from it knowing that in the modern era, total war is decided on the factory floors, the shipping lanes, and the assembly lines, long before the first shot is ever fired. And when an industrial powerhouse like the United States commits its entire national will to victory, no force on earth can stand against the rising tide of steel.